ain't going back. Not gonna buy into all that. Hey, ain't gonna hide, gonna let all the fears slide. Got Mother Nature is on my side. Got all of the loving growing inside.
Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to the New Now. I'm delighted to have a first-time guest on with us, Jonathan Zapp. He is a far-seer, dream interpreter, oracle, life and writing coach, and a general all-around, I guess you could call him a man of mystery. Jonathan, welcome to the show. Today, we're going to touch upon what I would feel would be the topic of topics that's the most important and maybe least understood, the mind parasites. Jonathan, welcome to the New Now.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. We're talking across vast oceans and distances of space from Boulder, Colorado to Japan.
Yes. I love
the miracle of modern technology, I guess.
It is. It's like, you know, when the modern shenanigans started a couple of years ago, you know, I was depressed for a little while, the same as everyone else. It gave me a bit of stress, we'll say. And then since then, I've had a chance and an opportunity to meet virtually with people all across this lovely plane, you know, from Boulder to Australia to parts of Europe to all parts of Canada and the United States, South America, etc. So I feel, you know, taking a challenge and moving forward, you know, and seeing what's stopping you and getting over it is the way to get to what you would love to live with in your life. So Jonathan, perhaps you can give us a bit of background about what you do, what you've done. You know, you wrote on the Mind Parasites. I was just looking at your article that was about, it's over 10 years since you published that one, and perhaps how you got there and where you may be with that topic today.
Okay, well, I guess you could call me a generalist. You know, I'm very influenced by Carl Jung, who talked about the era of soulless experts and believed in being a generalist. So I pride myself in being eclectic and being a generalist myself. Went to college for English and philosophy and got a master's degree in creative writing from NYU. I taught high school English. I was a gemologist and done a variety of different things. But in the last, more recent phase of my life, I've focused almost exclusively on my writing. Though writing is really just the medium, the content can be incredibly varied. Most recently, it's been a 43-year project to bring a fantasy epic into realization called Parallel Journeys, but I'm mostly known for nonfiction and kind of a philosopher of the paranormal. And so the mind parasite topic is an example of that kind of subject matter. But of course, this subject matter also plays into my fantasy fiction as well. So, you know, it's interesting that like we're here during the time of the great pandemic, and the pandemic is caused by a virus, and a virus is a parasite. So parasites are a gigantic player in human history and human experience on so many different levels. And that right now we're just talking about the normal parasites that science completely recognizes. According to National Geographic, parasites outnumber all other species 3 or 4 to 1. And most parasites themselves have parasites, like malaria is a microbial parasite inside the mosquito. And parasites, there's some British biologists who came up with what they call the Red Queen hypothesis, that says that sexual reproduction, as compared to asexual reproduction that preceded it in evolution, came into being because of parasites. That because parasites outnumber hosts, the only way that hosts could stay a step ahead of parasites, at least enough to survive them, was through the greater genetic novel of sexual reproduction as compared to the more primitive asexual reproduction. So parasites are huge players in every part of our lives. And when we look at relationships in nature, we're basically looking at relationships of energetic transaction, right? So 3 of the most classic of these relationships of energetic transaction are symbiosis, my favorite, predation. Human beings are technically classified as predators. I mean, I don't know how technical it is. I mean, we do kill animals, and we're at the top of the food chain, at least seemingly.
Yeah.
The Gnostics might say that archons or some unseen parasitic species might actually be at the top of the food chain, and convince us that we're at the top of it, but we can get into that a little bit. And then the third classic relationship, parasitism. And the topic can seem very fanciful or far-fetched or something like that, but basically it is completely possible for our species to miss an entire dimension of life. And so the dimension of life that every culture missed up until around the 1600s, maybe it was the early 1700s, when it was a Danish shopkeeper. He had a shop that sold curtains, I think, and so he had optics, to count the threads and stuff like that. And this was A.V. Leeuwenhoek, and he was the guy who ground the first lenses fine enough to make the first microscope. And he discovered a protozoa, a relative giant of the microbial world. But pretty soon microscopes got better, and we discovered that oh my God, every culture had missed an entire dimension of life, the microbiological dimension, which is full of predators, parasites, and symbionts, the same relationships of energetic transaction. So now I believe that there is, I think that the evidence supports, a third dimension of life that we can call the energetic plane. You can call it the spiritual plane if you want. I mean, we're really just talking about something that's not as easily discerned by our physical senses as the microbial dimension is not. But our current materialist instruments don't allow us to see the energetic plane as well, though some people have done interesting things with, like, Kirlian photography and stuff like that. And this is a plane of a dimension of life that every culture across every period has recognized. Really, the only culture I can think of that has not recognized the domain of energetic life forms would be not Western culture, just materialist, fundamentalist materialist culture, the culture of scientism. But that a culture is in trouble when it just discards, without even bothering to explain in any way, a vast body of human testimony. And we have testimony from every culture in every period, and including our culture, including, reports that people bring me all the time of organisms that live on a more energetic plane. And so we have words for them, from like the Christians might call them incubi and succubi. The Buddhists have terms like hungry ghost or preta. And we have lots and lots of different names. But what every culture that's observed these organisms has said is basically some are symbionts, some are predators, and some are and a lot are parasites. And so the idea of, my dad was actually a parasitologist for the Navy during World War II, working in a base in. Later, he was in D-Day, but he was most of the war working in a lab in a base in San Diego, where they were like making slides of spirochetes, and stuff that were causing incurable syphilis that servicemen were picking up abroad and this kind of thing. So I grew up with and seeing these, like, looks like a spring sharpened at both ends, seeing these spirochetes. And, I grew up with a healthy fear and respect of parasites, having a parasitologist for a father. And then I noticed after many decades of doing dream interpretation, how many people would bring me these very stereotyped spectral attack reports that happened that they thought must be a dream or fall into that category because they happen at night. But I was struck by how stereotyped they were, and usually completely divorced from any psychological content. So, there's a million different points on the mind parasite, for lack of a better term. That was a term I got from the British occultist and novelist Colin Wilson, who wrote a wonderful novel of ideas called The Mind Parasites in like the late 60s. But there's a million points on that map, but that's a little intro, and I'm open for any questions or you might have about that subject.
Well, for sure. How do you how did you define divorced from, you know, psychological content, the experiences they had? What do you mean by that?
Well, in other words, you know, a dark specter appears that's just like a big shadow looming over them. It doesn't look like their dad. There's no like, you know, motifs that you might find in, you know, a big dream where it's asking to be interpreted. Going by the person from a phenomenological point of view and going from the person's felt experience of what's going on, it just seems more like an attack by an intruder of some sort. It doesn't seem to have like, it's not like they're unconscious teaching them a lesson about, you know, something or about their own shadow or something like that, because I'd be very keyed into that as a Jungian and a dream interpreter. I'm all about that kind of stuff, but these reports wouldn't have that kind of stuff at all. It just like, you know, if you were attacked by a mugger or something, it usually isn't full of symbolic content. It's just like, you know, your money or your life kind of thing. And in this case, it's about usually about trying to scare people to harvest some of their energy, is what it would seem like, or to harvest their sexual energy. And that was reported by the Christians, you know, and that's why they had report demons that were specifically seem like sexual parasites. I mean, we call them predators, not in the sense that they kill anybody, but in the sense that they, in the more conventional sense of a sex predator, or somebody who, you know, doesn't follow ethics and invades your boundaries and this kind of thing, you know.
Well, where would you place them? Let's say I've heard two ends, so to speak, of a conversation on the good or the bad of chakras. And, you know, I've heard a lot of people say you should study them and increase them and make sure they're strong and clean. And then I've heard the other side claiming that this is where those parasites live and latch onto. When you mentioned the sexual parasites, you know, I thought of, you know, the sexual chakras and how they could claim energy through those sort of, I guess, energetic vortexes or energetic, because it could be holes of depletion as well, you know, depending on your own spiritual practices. So what would you say? Have you heard about that? Do you have any opinion?
Well, I mean, in Chinese medicine, you know, and there are these like 500 something, I don't forget the number, of acupuncture points. I mean, and even Western medicine admits the efficaciousness of acupuncture. And something like 28 of those 500 something point energy meridians, or whatever they call them, begin with the prefix Kui, which means disincarnate entity. And so according to Chinese medicine, those are specific energy meridians where disincarnate entities will often feed.
Oh my goodness.
And in Ayurvedic medicine, the study of non-solid entities and their effects on human health is a medical subspecialty on a par with cardiology or gynecology or something like that. So now, where exactly they feed off of in terms of your energy body, I'm not able to put too fine a point on it. But what does seem clear, there's even a discussion of this in my fantasy epic, is that they seem to prefer sort of the redder spectrum of human energy, emotion, and sexual chi. You know, the anger, fear, greedy desire, and this kind of thing. If you are on the bluer end of the spectrum, you might have more, and you can relate these colors to chakras if you want. You have more, you know, awakened mind and spiritual equanimity. They don't vibe with that energy at all. They want, in order to harvest your energy, individually or collectively. And so this is sort of like what the Gnostics said in documents like the Nag Hammadi library that was only discovered after World War II, that some people have interpreted the bizarre death cult of the Nazis as a archon attack. You know, there are people who believe that Hitler had a vision of the demiurge, the head of the archons. The archons were basically a parasitic species that the Gnostics claimed ruled over mankind and would keep us at a forever war with each other through religions, through distortions of religions, so that they could harvest our negative emotions by keeping us in a state of strife. The movie The Matrix is basically a technological sci-fi AI transference of the Nag Hammadi library and these Gnostic writings, and which make more sense than the movie The Matrix, because the idea that this advanced AI needs to keep humans in cocoons for their caloric energy is kind of ridiculous, because, I mean, you should be able to use nuclear power or, you know, a whole variety of much more efficient means than human bodies to produce heat. But the energy that we have, far more than that you cannot generate from a nuclear reactor or many more efficient heat sources, is human consciousness and human sexual chi and human emotional energy. And that actually seems to be a commodity that other species are very interested in, because parasites go toward the richest energy deposit they can find. You know, so if you're a mosquito, you know, that's blood. Blood is full of all kinds of, you know, chemical goodies for a mosquito. But if you're a more advanced parasite, then you might be interested in the most potent energy on this planet that's transformed everything about it, at least on the surface of the planet. And that, of course, is like human consciousness, and human energy seems to be the most potent energy in our worlds. And they're very interested in that. And this really isn't too surprising, shouldn't be considered too surprising or fantastical idea, because basically, when we look at nature, we find organisms feeding on other organisms. I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, we have trillions of bacteria in our gut that are feeding off of nutrients there, but it's a symbiotic relationship if you have a healthy internal biome. So, I mean, it's all just about, and we feed on lots of other life. So, and we have a history of missing life, dimensions of life, like the microbiological plane. So, the idea is that we need to be careful, because we may be missing other organisms that are major players in our food pyramid, our food chain, and we may be food for something else.
Well, let's say there's, like, I understand what you're talking about, but let's say there's a viewer here or a watcher that's coming to this, early on in their understanding. What would you say to them? Perhaps the indications may be of this kind of an attack, something close to them, something they're feeling, something to keep an eye on, in relation to, their overall well-being and what they're feeling in their life at the moment. I need clues.
So this is a very, this is where it gets tricky, because most people are not as strong in psychological self-awareness as we might want them to be, and awareness of their own shadow. So once you introduce this topic, now we have a very confusing situation of, like, what is a mind parasite attack and what is more ordinary human neurosis, psychosis, and so forth. And it's a very tricky discernment. It's very slippery to distinguish those. But, I've had experiences. I had an experience, for example, that woke me up in the middle of the night and into a state of sleep paralysis, which is a normal neurological function, because your brain needs to paralyze you while you're dreaming. Otherwise, you'd be thrashing around based on the drama of what's going on in the dream. And there are some elderly people that lose that neurological function and have to can't sleep in the same bed as their partner, sadly, because they might hit them or something, and because they've lost that sleep paralysis function. It's a normal function. But something seemed to be imposing that function after I had regained consciousness. I felt paralyzed, almost like Gulliver and Gulliver's Travels, where he wakes up and the Lilliputians or someone have lashed these bindings around him and he can't move. And I'm aware of a lenticular shaped entity that is like hovering. I was sleeping in an RV that night that was hovering near the ceiling of the RV. Now, I had gone to sleep in the same RV with a friend who actually warned me that he was a vampire before I went to sleep. And I interpreted that psychologically and kind of dismissed it and all that kind of stuff. He had come over because he had just had a very traumatic breakup with his girlfriend, and we were talking about that. And I just kind of interpreted it as a psychological artifact, this statement. But I think it was much more literally true. And so they may attach themselves to people and work through them or something. And it was, this organism was sort of shaped like a spiral galaxy or a lenticular cloud or something. And, but it was, its outline was vague and shadowy, and it was dark on the sleeping loft of my RV. But I felt this massive energy draining from me, to the point where, if this goes on for a few heartbeats, I'm not sure what's going to happen, because this is really draining my energy so much. But then what happened was, I was also well aware, I'd already started studying the subject, and I'm like, wow, well, I should really pay attention, because now I've really got a live specimen here, and I'm going to get to see. And what happened was, at first I was afraid, which is an energy being the part of the color spectrum could feed off of. But once my mind turned on, and the kind of the blue light of the mind, then that's like exposing a parasitical germ to ultraviolet light. It's extremely toxic to them. They need to work in the shadows. They need to keep you in a state of fear and confusion. So once my mind turned on, the feeding stopped, and then this organism just made some kind of a animalistic guttural sound, like an animal that was interrupted and was feeling primal frustration in the midst of feeding. And then it just crawled back through the interdimensional floorboards, like a bed bug, interdimensional bed bug retreating into whatever dimension from whence it came, and disappeared. And when I reported this to the young friend the next morning, he said, well, I told you I was a vampire. He didn't seem surprised at all.
So was this before you started writing and talking about it, or is this one?
This was after. But I had other experiences, like, for example, because when you're in a vulnerable state in general, like maybe you've had an emotional shock, or you're drunk, or have taken some other boundary dissolving chemical. So I remember one time it was a boundary dissolving thing. I think it was psychedelic mushrooms. And with a definite periodicity, I would hear this, I'd feel this energetic attack that would come every 6 or 7 seconds. And it would the way my mind would interpret it, it had a sound or something. It was cancer killer, cancer killer. And with each penetration of this energy, or whatever it was, this thought form, would come very gruesome and disturbing images. And it was that would create ripples of fear, because I was in a vulnerable state, and you take a boundary dissolving substance, now you kind of light up and are in a more vulnerable state on the energetic plane. It's almost like if you from the Lord of the Ring movies, when Frodo would put on the ring, and suddenly the ring wraiths he'd be visible to them on their plane of reality, and they looked very parasite-like, and then they're trying to find the precious, and this kind of thing, like any parasite is. And so sometimes in a vulnerable state, you may observe, if you're somebody that's able to has enough discernment to tell what's your own inner darkness versus an outside agent, which is a very slippery distinction, that there's something else there kind of taking advantage and egging it on. Or like these people who wake up with these very dramatic spectral attacks in the middle of the night that are observed in every culture. You know, the old hag, you know, is an example of one, the shadow people, you know, there are these very classic types of reports.
What would you feel someone can do when something like that happens? I mean, I've had bad dreams. I've had horrible experiences. You know, I've done boundary dissolving substances, as you say, and I've had all of those experiences as well. And, you know, for me, I can feel them around me a lot. I just don't allow them to negatively affect my life any longer since I'm aware of them. You know, as you say, I keep myself away from the fear-based vibrations. What would you feel is a good way for someone perhaps to develop an enhanced defense against such parasites?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, and there actually are there's like a whole school called, I don't know how good it is though, but it's called Clair, C-L-A-I-R vision, that would actually teach people. There was a book called something like Entities of the Energetic Plane by an MD named Samuel Sagan, kind of like Carl Sagan, but Samuel Sagan. And his book was quite interesting. So there are actual practitioners, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. I don't know how good they are, that will, and you know, maybe some Qigong people and so forth. There are people who will claim to be able to remove parasites. Now, I'm not a healer. I'm more of a theorist. So I don't claim to have foolproof techniques, but I mean, I think the basic ones are intention. You know, I am kind of a chaos magician, which just means that I think the most powerful rituals are the ones that you invent because they're more intentional and you don't need a tradition. So, you know, many traditions have their own techniques for warding rooms and, you know, this kind of thing. But setting intentions, you know, of boundaries, you know, setting an intention before you go to sleep. Any kind of magical ritual you want to invent yourself, or you can look them up if you prefer it. Somebody else has invented it for you, burning sage around you, you know, the perimeter of the room before you go to sleep. Any of these kind of things, but I think coolly observing them. They don't like metacognition. That's when you're aware of your own internal thought process. I mean, the thing that's oppressing most people is what Jung called psychic entropy, which are these like looping negative thought forms and so forth. And lots of people will do almost anything to be taken out of psychic entropy. And they will self-medicate, and they will prefer to be in company, because if you have other people talking to you, it will tend to, you're focusing your attention on the outside will tend to mute the psychic entropy somewhat. And that's why people report being happier when in company with others, and all the psychopathologies of, you know, drinking and self-mutilation and all that kind of stuff, it all tend to get worse when people are by themselves. So, but in my mind, I'm not so oppressed by psychic entropy as I might have been many years ago, because I'm very active in my own mind. I'm like very entertained in my own mind, having my own thoughts. You don't want to be a passive daydreamer in your mind where anything outside force can come in and create an image or whatever. You want to be more like an active movie director. So if you're very aware and in charge of your own content, then like if something dark starts coming up, you're like, okay, where did that come from? You know, is that my own shadow? That's the first place to look. And is it, or is it some kind of an invading thought form from outside? But the extreme danger in pointing out mind parasites is that most people have not integrated their shadows. And so therefore they will much prefer to project the dark content of their minds onto outside agents. And a classic example of this happening culturally is QAnon. where you have very bizarre, if you're familiar with the QAnon conspiracy theory that's popular worldwide, but especially in America, and it's really a retread of the classic anti-Semitic blood libel that's been around for hundreds of years, where Jews were said to be using children's blood to make matzah, which is kind of an absurd, from about 500 years ago, it's sort of an absurd idea because, you know, Jesus was a Jew and his Last Supper was a Passover Seder. So that would mean that Jesus must be a child vampire as well, or where did the matzah, the Last Supper, like we see in Leonardo da Vinci's painting, or fresco, whatever it was that deteriorated because he put it on the wrong wall. But where did all that come from? But it's also kind of absurd because the Jewish holiday of Passover long predated the existence of Christianity. So for a couple of thousand years, at least, there were no Christian children available to make matzah with and so forth. But rationality doesn't matter when it comes to, and you know, like in this country right now, we have a collective psychosis on the left and on the right. And so these collective psychoses, which I learned a lot from Carl Jung, you know, who studied them. You can read volume 10 of his collective work, Civilization and Transition. He was able to predict the coming of Hitler and the Nazis based on the dreams of his educated German patients who were dreaming about Wotan, a Germanic god of war and mayhem. So we have collective mind parasite attacks. I'm probably losing the thread of your question now. You can remind me what it is, because I'm riffing on like,
yeah, how people can understand that and maybe tie it back into the QAnon, you know.
Right. So with QAnon, oh yeah. So I started off on QAnon because of how people project their own dark contents onto somebody else. Right. So as some other Jungians have pointed out, these are people who are constantly thinking about adults doing bad things with children. And so now they have to imagine that it's Hillary Clinton and John Podesta and Tom Hanks and all this unlikely collection of celebrities who are doing it. But actually, they're the ones who are thinking about this stuff. It reflects more on them, and they may be getting manipulated by mind parasites, because these grotesque fantasies have a parasite-like motif or aspect to them. And so, but you know, most violence is done in a state of shadow projection, where you're projecting your darkness and hatefulness onto another group that you imagine is the boogeyman. And so, you know, this is what you have to be really careful about, is human beings are endlessly confused when it comes to the psyche about what's inside and what's outside.
Right.
And it takes a lot. You really have to know your own shadow before you can distinguish the blurred boundaries between it and dark forces outside and invading forces, especially because you have entities that can meet you on the psychic plane, on the plane of the psyche and of your consciousness. That's a very blurred boundary situation. And so you need to be very aware of, you know, like Socrates' commandment, know thyself. You have to really know yourself and your own psyche and take responsibility for your own darkness to have any hope of discerning something else.
It makes sense what you're saying. So do you mean like with QAnon and the blaming celebrities or what have you, comes back to responsibility for your own thoughts, your own beliefs, your own feelings. And if you stop laying blame, you'll have a better grip on what's going on inside you in relation to the mind parasites?
You'll be much less able to be manipulated by mind parasites. Because if you're a big shadow projector, where you're the good guy and never reflect on that, and it's the libtards, or it's the, you know, the Trump or people or whatever it is where you project the shadow onto, well, now you are like what Gurdjieff would call food for the moon. You are like food for the parasites, because if you're a shadow projector, you can be manipulated 24 hours a day.
Right.
But if you do take responsibility for your own contents of your own psyche, it means you're more powerful or more of a magician in your own psyche, and therefore you're not as easily taken over by these things. So, for example, in this country, we had the era of the Salem witch trials, with the Puritans, who had a very weird, they were a Protestant sect that had such a creepy way of viewing God and sin and so forth. You were, it was predestined whether you were going to spend all of eternity in hell, and only the elect were those who would be saved, but you wouldn't know that if you're the elect or the damned, and you don't really have a choice over that. It's a very bizarre setup. And so these are people like the famous sermons of the Protestant minister Jonathan Edwards, the hellfire and brimstone sermons. I don't know if you've heard them. The most classic they used to teach it in English is called "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." And he would say stuff like, "To God, you are like the most loathsome of spiders, and he can barely stand to hold over you as he dangles you above the pit of eternal hell. And he wants to let go of you because you're such a wretched sinner, but it's only his mercy." All this kind of stuff. So you have such a twisted belief system that now you are like in such a schizoid state, and you're looking for the darkness everywhere. So if you're living in a Puritan community and you have a wet dream about Mary Goodwife or something like that, well, that's you can take that to a court of law. That was considered spectral evidence that not that you are having a fantasy or something going on in you. That's evidence that she's a witch, and she could be burned because of that spectral evidence. So, there's an example of like a maximal case of zero responsibility for what's going on in your psyche. It's even the court encourages you to project that onto some unsuspecting woman, and these were not the gold medalists in shadow integration, the Puritans. They were gold medalists in shadow projection. And we have a lot more people who are gold medalists in shadow projection. That's one of the most popular sports. And certainly in America, but to some extent in many other countries where totalitarianism seems to be on the rise, shadow projection is one of the all-time favorite sports.
Well, how would you...
Which makes you so easy to be manipulated by parasitic forces that want to keep us in a state of eternal strife.
How would you turn this around, let's say, to the elephant in the room, we'll say, or the viral shenanigans in the room, of the modern challenges that seem to be going on worldwide in relation to all of this? I have my sneaking suspicions about what's really going on, and I think may very well be what you just mentioned, a huge psychotic break towards becoming, as you mentioned, a gold medalist of shadow projection.
Right. Well, one time Jung was giving a seminar in the Weimar Republic, pre-war Germany, and there were, I guess maybe it wasn't even the Weimar Republic now. It must have been already, Hitler must have already been in power, because there were brown shirts, literally goose stepping outside on the street. And people in the seminar said, like, well, given the state of the world, like, what should we do? And Jung said, begin first by reclaiming your shadow from the world. Begin by, at least don't project your shadow onto the world. Or like Goethe said, another German, if you want to clean up the whole world, begin with your own doorstep. Now, the thing is that Jung, like myself, we're introverted thinking types. The people who are the social engineers are more the extroverted thinking types. So I look, I'm very interested in first causes and psychology and stuff like that. And I'm less geared toward like, well, how do we fix the whole world? How do we socially engineer everybody to stop doing this? I have more of the individual answer, which is, as an individual, to practice shadow integration. If everybody did that, we wouldn't have this problem. What to do, since we do have the problem, and it's a global problem, that's not as clear.
No.
And I don't know who has that answer, but it's not me. But right now, things are in a very dangerous state, particularly in the States. I mean, this is the craziest that I've seen it. And where it's on the left, we have wokeism with all of its very insane projections. And then on the right, we have Trumpism, white supremacy, these interlocking things. But the collective psychosis on the right is the more dangerous. They both feed on each other because the excesses of wokeism exacerbate and give excuses and reasons to the, Trumpists or whatever you want to call them, and vice versa. So they're giving them evidence of white supremacy. So now the religion of anti-racism, as African-American professor of linguistics at Columbia, John McWhorter calls it. He just wrote an excellent book called Woke Racism. He is one of my heroes because he understood the wokeism in the same way that I did as a religion, because this is what's happening. This is what human beings do. We make religions out of things. You can make it out of anti-racism. You can make a religion out of a multi-level marketing scheme with, a charismatic leader and, fake revival hearing. You can make it out of, a dietary scheme like raw foods and become an evangelist for raw foodism or veganism or paleo. We do it with all kinds of different things, saucer cults and so forth. And so, but this is another version of saying collective psychosis. So this is going on constantly. And, there are many different individual strategies, because I'm like I said, I'm an introverted thinker. So I think in terms of the individual psyche and that kind of thing, like it says in the I Ching, sometimes by fighting evil directly, you only sharpen its fangs. Just focus on making energetic progress toward the good. Because to some extent, I mean, we need to work on multiple levels. So in other words, there's the chemical level and there's the alchemical level. So on the chemical level, I've written 25 articles about Trump. I will vote for the most sane candidate I can. That's all on the chemical level, the causal plane. Though the articles kind of are somewhat on both, because they're entering the alchemical plane, where you have more of like acausal relationships and things like that, where you are working on the thing that is the source of collective psychosis, of human-caused environmental destruction, of anything economic, injustice, craziness of any kind economically. All of these things are 100% products of psyche. So as Jung said, there is no hydrogen bomb in nature. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. Psyche is the great danger. So from the alchemical point of view, and from the point of view of what I work on, I want to look into psyche. I want to, instead of looking at the back of Plato's cave, the projection screen where all these crazy events happen, I want to look at the first cause, the primal cause of it, which is psyche. So it's just like 100 years ago when there was other political craziness going on. Stephen Dedalus, the James Joyce character, said, "History is the nightmare from which I am trying to awaken." So I want to look at what generates dreams and nightmares, which of course is the psyche.
Do you think that maybe humanity has been led? I mean, I see the cause and effect of everything you've just mentioned. Do you think humanity is being led down that path by the mind parasites? Through, as you say, being more susceptible when you're alone. And if you look at lockdowns and separation and masking and all this other nonsense going on right now, people are being forced in their way to be by themselves. Or so I've seen, right? And you can do both. As you say, you can look inside and heal yourself by being by yourself, which is a path I've taken as well, to understand my own thought process and my own projections, blames, history, etc., which is the positive of it. But do you feel it's been engineered on purpose, this separation, this loneliness, this higher levels of angst by an intelligent, unseen you can call them the archons if you like, or
well, so if you're a conspiratist, then you'll believe that it's a group of human puppet masters,
right?
And often find a lot of false positives. Not that there aren't human puppet masters who have real conspiracies, but you'll tend to you'll tend to show a lack of reality testing, because many conspiratists will act as if everything is being orchestrated by one group of puppet masters, when it's so obvious to anybody that's intelligently looking at the world that we see a whole bunch of competing spheres of power. China and England are not the same sphere of power. You know, neither are Google, neither are like Apple and Samsung even, you know, though they might sell each other semiconductors or whatever occasionally. And so I don't think it's because of the machinations of a central group of Illuminati or human egos. Mm-hmm. Now, could it be influenced, like the Gnostics said, by a species that we're not normally aware of, that sits above us on the food chain? Well, there's a lot to support that idea. I'm not going to, I'm a skeptic in the sense of what the word actually meant, which the Greek philosophers who believed your powers of thinking and observation were diminished once you arrived at definite conclusions, which we know now from cognitive psychology, confirmation bias. So the idea of people who call themselves skeptics are usually not skeptics. They're true believers in negatives, and they're debunkers. They're the opposite of skeptics in the original meaning. But I'm a skeptic in that I try not to become too much of a hardened true believer, because then I'm going to be fooled. Because as JBS Haldane said, reality is not only stranger than you think, it's stranger than you can think. So I try to have the humility to realize that things are probably a lot stranger than I'm able to think. Having said that, the idea that there is another species manipulating us has a lot going for it. But when we look at something like a collective psychosis, it's sort of thing that seems to be overdetermined, in the sense that there are many different causal vectors that you can point to, and a whole multiplicity of factors seems to be involved. Now, whether there is another outside agent, another species that is pushing that along, well, we have testimony and, related to that from many different cultures over many different periods. And so I think it's a confluence of many, many different factors, and non-skeptical minds want to zero in on just one and be like, it's because of economic injustice or systemic racism or X, Y, and Z, and every one of these factors will play some part, but it's merely a part of a very complex whole.
Where would you say is a good place for our viewers to start? Like, I would agree with you. You have to keep an open mind and an open conscience and an open feeling for what's going on. And once you come to a conclusion, I found for myself the same. I'm usually proven wrong, so things are always evolving in life and moving towards a level of further understanding, as far as I would say. If you're open-minded, as you say, and open-hearted towards, where you're going in life, there's always room for growth for sure. So, where would you feel is a good place for any of the viewers to start that want to get a better understanding of this topic? The
somewhat self-promoting answer would be my website, ZAP, Z-A-P, Oracle, O-R-A-C-L-E, oracle.com. And there's no paywall, there are no ads. I spend far more on my creative output than it's ever brought in, which is almost nothing. So it's all there as a public service. I've got a YouTube channel called Zap Oracle. You can also find many of my things, all the same 78 YouTubes or whatever can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so forth. The introductory essay podcast is called Mind Parasites, Energy Parasites, and Vampires. That's a good one to start on. And then all my other writings, have some relationship to this, and they could be seen as supporting the integrity of your consciousness, because it can be unhealthy in some ways to focus on the parasites too much. I don't try not to give them an excess amount of focus in my own life, because it's like Nietzsche said, if you gaze over long into an abyss, the abyss gazes back into you. You know, it's, or they tell race car drivers, if you're heading toward the wall, don't look at the wall, look at where you want to go. So, or the I Ching would say, make energetic progress toward the good. So there's a lot of stuff there on how to make energetic progress toward the good, like my Zap Oracle that has 664 cards. A free membership saves your readings indefinitely, because it's a good shadow location tools. Oracles properly used can help you locate your own shadow by acting as like a mirror of the self. And there are many writings on my website about shadow integration and things like that. So that's one starting point. But otherwise, you know, read the writings of Carl Jung. You know, there are many great, you know, we live in the golden age right now. I mean, we have infinite resources. You know, everybody does, you know, has one of these where you can, you know, you've got access to more information than you could, valuable information than you could explore in a million lifetimes. There's a ton of trash and parasite riddled, you know, disease out there too, but you have to use your own discernment and find quality sources of higher impressions and culture.
Well, I would agree. I think there's no excuse if you want to do some research right now. There is nothing but good information out there. If you use your discernment and you use your feelings, your intuition, you know, let's say you go from a heart level and a head level, I found, and you find what resonates, if you like, with you. You definitely can find some answers if you're sincerely seeking a way to heal yourself with whatever ails you. And I would say the mind parasite, right, you know, is definitely one of the hidden symptoms or hidden diseases, let's say, the cause of disease in the world today.
Right.
You know, and I appreciate your opinion with us today, Jonathan. Thank you so much. You know, perhaps we've come to a useful conclusion on this hour we've chatted, more or less. If anybody has any questions or any suggestions or anywhere they may like to go, I'd be delighted to talk with Jonathan again, as we're both available, and to further develop what could be possible. I will leave Jonathan's links below. Perhaps Jonathan can share with us, if he likes as well, a bit of a bio and some of the books and sources that have been mentioned in this chat, if anybody wants to do some further research, or, you know, they can Google them or what have you and figure them out for themselves as well.
Yeah, if you go to my website, About section, right there in the navigator, that's the bio. And then category menu, one of the categories is Mind Parasites. You'll find all kinds of podcasts and documents related to that.
Beautiful. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
For all of our viewers, there's a way around, there's a way to heal, and there's a way to be better. This is how I would say one of the major steps in developing your new now is to find out what's challenging you, inside, outside, in every dimension you can imagine. Jonathan, thank you so much. I hope to chat with you again soon.
Take care.
Can't make me lie to my heart. No one tells me where I should start. Freedom